Good evening, this is woodblock printmaker David Bull here at my workbench in our shop in Asakusa, Tokyo. Our recent videos have jumped around quite a bit in theme, showing you some prints from my collection, rambling about my early days of printmaking, or even showing print parties here in our shop. Tonight's video is going to take us back to our roots here on this YouTube channel. We are going to see one of the Ukiyo-e Heroes prints come to life, watching as the impressions build up one by one from blank paper right up to the finished image. The process you're about to watch took place here in our Asakusa building, in the printer's room up on the 3rd floor. The printer is Natsuki Suga, who we saw in a previous video a few months ago. Her work that time was the proofing of this one, the Times Burned Bright design. That was a very, very long and complex printing, taking, I think, maybe about 30 impressions. This one is different. The image, entitled Two Souls Entwined, also of course by Jed Henry, is actually close to the classical ukiyo-e, with mostly flat colors bounded by the lines of the key block. But if you think it was simple for Suga-san to print, she would have something to say about that. When she and I were working on the initial trial printing, we found it very difficult to get all things in balance on this print. Too deep on the background colors and the men wouldn't stand out, but too light on the back and the print lost power. And you can't effectively tell how it actually works when you're doing test printing until you've got a completely dried sheet in your hand. When things don't seem quite right, it's back to the drawing board, the printing bench, to start again. But she and I kept at it, of course, and I think we ended up with a print that will take its place in a long line of Ukiyo-e Heroes series designs that have come to life so far. More about that a bit later. Anyway, let's look over her shoulder as she gets to work. Let's go up to the 3rd floor. Work on a traditional Japanese woodblock print always begins with the key block, the one that contains the outlines of the design. This is frequently a surprise to people who are more familiar with Western oil-based work. They see this and ask, won't those lines be covered up by the subsequent color printing? Well, the easy answer is no, they won't. As you will see over the next few minutes, the colorants used are quite transparent, and when they are applied in a light, watery manner, these block lines will remain clearly visible. This particular print is slightly unusual in comparison to most ukiyo-e work in that it has 2 key blocks. You just saw the printing of the main black outlines, but Jed designed this in a way that there are figures in the background, the dragons, and these have their own separate outlines in a fainter tone. As you can see, Suga-san is printing these outlines in blue. Having 2 key blocks puts quite a bit of extra pressure on the printer because these 2 keys have to be aligned exactly. Many of the subsequent color blocks will be bounded by both of these blocks, so any mistake at this point would be irreparable later. Here's the first of the actual color impressions, and as you can see, there is something a bit strange about this block. It contains carved areas for 2 colors, and these are arranged heads and tails on the wood, each with their own registration marks. We'll see this block again later on in the process, rotated the other way around. And do you see how Suga-san makes sure that the paper doesn't flop down on her printing bench? She's got a little block of wood back there to support it. Although I myself would have used something a little bit softer, maybe a rolled cloth. If her baron happened to press on the edge of that block, it would leave a mark in the paper. This color block has very small and delicate areas in comparison with the one we just saw. She has selected a more gentle baron from her tool drawer to use on this one. These next 2 impressions are quite similar in that they are both grey, but there's grey and there's grey. For most ukiyo-e printing, grey is produced on a print by using a dilute sumi ink, but we rarely use that as is, just diluted with water. A printer will almost always put a touch of something else into the mix. It might be a tiny splash of blue or red, sometimes even a bit of a blended color, green. And here you can now see the difference between these 2 impressions. Both grey, but with quite a different tint and feeling. This is the rotation of the same block we saw back in step 3. And again, Suga-san is using the wooden support for her paper. And aha, I see that these video clips were taken while carving of the final part of this block. The Shomenzuri was still taking place. We'll explain what that's all about later in step 15 of 13. What's this though? Why is she putting the paper back into the input stack? Aha, I see. She is going to do this color as a double impression. There are 2 basic ways to do this. You can run through the entire stack first with a single impression, then start over and do it all again using the same block. Today she is doing it in a different way, with the second impression following quickly right after the first without waiting. This is a bit more difficult as the paper is now very wet at that spot and it's very easy to stretch it or perhaps leave barren marks in the color. Okay, here's something that we saw back on the very first impression, the key block. It sometimes happens that the carved areas of the block lie quite close to the registration marks. When this happens, the brush touches those also, and they become stained with the pigment. A careless printer, very common in the old days when they didn't care about such things, will just leave this, and the finished print will show a stain on the paper at that point. Suga-san is using a little metal tool she made to make sure that the pigment doesn't stain the registration marks in this area. Let's freeze the image at this point just for a second. Do you remember when I mentioned that the use of two key blocks made the printer's work much more difficult? Well, here's why. Look down near the lower right. The dark black that she just printed had to fit perfectly within both the key block lines of the man's clothing and the outlines of the blue dragon. If they hadn't been perfectly aligned right back at the beginning, she would now be in big trouble. Do you see, she's changed her clothes again. Why would she do that between colors? Well, of course, what you're seeing here is a process that took place over a number of days. I think she had around 80 sheets in her stack, and a normal workday might see 3 or 4 colors printed onto the sheets. That may seem a bit slow, but it's not just a matter of counting the seconds it takes for each impression. What you're not seeing in a video like this is all the extraneous work. Things like the adjustment of moisture level in the paper, mixing the pigments, all sorts of things. So any complex print job like this will of course take many days to complete. It's really starting to come together. Getting the color palette to blend this well wasn't trivial at all, Sometimes the tighter the palette is, in this case just blues and greens, the more difficult it is to get a beautiful balance.
いろんな青がある。これは美愛だし、これは群青、これは本愛だし、いろいろ混ざった。みんな違う種類の愛が揃ってますね。
People are frequently surprised when they see just how small an amount of pigment is required for this work. We saw her dab just a touch of paste onto the wood with her left hand, followed by a couple of small swabs of pigment with her other hand. These are then blended together and spread over the block with the brush. She'll make a few final gentle strokes to ensure that no brush marks remain. We've seen this block once before, back in step 4. Unlike the heads and tails pairing we saw earlier, these two colours are carved in the same registration. They are a tad too close together to allow her to rub both pigments on at the same time, which would save a lot of time. The blue-black would get mixed with the green. She also has to be very careful here not to allow even the slightest touch of her brush onto those nearby green areas. It is very easy for the printer to be careless here and not discover that the green area has been hit. That was the end of the printing proper, but there are still 2 stages to go. On all of our Ukiyo-e Heroes prints, we emboss the names of the carver and printer. We do this with a small polymer plate. This has raised lettering, just like old metal type. She does this stage while the paper is still moist, just as though it was another printing impression. In this case, it reads Hori, that's carving, Kawasaki Noriko, and that's our young carver who lives down in Kobe. And then Suri, printing, Suga Natsuki. And in the old days, the idea that an ukiyo-e print could have been made by an all-female craftsperson combination would have been just unthinkable. But we weren't finished. The block you see here is about to be used with no pigment application for front rubbing, Shomenzuri in Japanese. This block is carved in a non-reverse orientation. And as you see, Suga-san places the paper, now carefully dried, face up. And it is the action of her baron that will give the paper a sheen only in the areas where there is support below. And here you see the result, only apparent when the paper is held at just the right angle to catch the light. There are probably going to be people who never notice this, but we don't mind. We know it's there. This Two Souls design is the 17th woodblock print we have issued in the main Ukiyo-e Heroes series. 17! When Jed-san and I first started this thing back in 2012, we had no idea what we were getting into. As we prepared to launch the original Kickstarter campaign in August of that year, we kind of knew that Jed's designs would be popular. I mean, he was already viral on places like Reddit, but we were far less, or I was far less confident that the woodblock versions would turn out to be viable. As we all now know, I needn't have worried. There was an overwhelming level of interest in the prints, and it has continued all the way along. As this series matured over the past few years, our style evolved somewhat. The earliest ones are a kind of pure ukiyo-e, as I mentioned before, outlines with flat colors inside. But echoing the transition of the old ukiyo-e into a more modern style using gradations and depth, our series has changed in the same way. And some of the recent prints, they're just stunning in their depth and visual interest. But there is more to the story. For both Jed and I, an important aspect to this entire project was the idea that our work could be a factor in bringing the traditional ukiyo-e genre back to life. In the old days, ukiyo-e was all about things that were relevant to people of the day. Kabuki actors from the theater, scenes of famous places around the country, images of movie stars, Yoshiwara stars. It was all about the pop culture of the day. But it wasn't just the thematic content that Jed and I wanted to bring into the 21st century. It was the whole approach to how these prints are viewed. Back in the old days, they weren't high art, they weren't limited editions, they weren't expensive. They were affordable and approachable and were grabbed up by people to use as part of their daily life. And this is why, within days of the success of the first Kickstarter campaign being assured, Jed and I began the second phase of our campaign for world woodblock domination. We began making sets of Ukiyo-e Heroes prints in a smaller format. A format small enough to help keep the price at a level that more people could afford. And even more importantly, a format that was less complex to produce, and that would thus provide work for the young people I had started to train in this field and who could not yet handle the complexity of the main Heroes prints. And here we are. Look at this photograph that Cameron and I set up this morning. Nearly 7 years after this all got started, we now have more than 100 different woodblock prints published to Jed's designs at a varied range of difficulty levels to provide work and training for everybody in our growing team for years to come. And when I say growing team, I'm not kidding. From this guy sitting quietly in his Ome workshop, slowly carving and printing designs one at a time, we now have around 24 people working here at Mokuhankan. Carvers, of course. Printers, of course. People packing and shipping prints, bookkeeping, making the blank woodblocks, shop assistants, print party staff. And this doesn't even count the people upstream that have so much more work now, the paper makers specifically and their upstream suppliers. It's a perfect storm of wonderful things coming together. The immersive worlds created by the game designers, the old traditional Japanese design ethics, the beautiful woodblock printmaking technology, and it's all wrapped together by Jed's hugely creative design ideas. It just doesn't get any better than this. It's been a fantastic ride for me over these past 7 years or so. And to all of you out there who have been a part of this, whether you've collected some of our prints or have simply enjoyed following along by watching these YouTube videos or our Twitch streams, we offer a heartfelt thank you Without enthusiastic support from the community, none of this would mean anything. And of course, it's not over yet. As I speak, there are a couple of stacks of freshly carved wood blocks sitting up in the printer's room. Yes, here they are. These are the blocks for the initial 2 designs in the Sushi Cat series. They are ready for trial printing. Suga-san, let's get busy. Thank you again, everybody, and see you soon with our next video. Good night for now.